Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts about The Broom of the System by David Foster Wallace. This is a book I read over the past 2 weeks, and I really wanted to dig into this book. There are a couple of ideas that I thought were really interesting, the limits of language, the different ways that Wallace was trying to express that, succeeding in some ways, failing in others. But there were also aspects of the book that I found sophomoric, jokes that I found repetitive. It was a book of excess. Not in the same way as Infinite Jest or even in some of Wallace's stories or essays, but a book of excess nonetheless. And I wanted to dig in because this is a book that my wife loved in college. And I wanted to see how do we approach a text, almost 20 years later? Do we still enjoy the same parts of it? Do we still grapple with the same questions as we did when first approaching to it? This is a book that she would talk about in college. It was one of the texts that my wife used to really as a benchmark in her reading, how she was challenging herself as a reader. And she would certainly move on to denser works, more complex works, more excessive works, not least Infinite Jest. And so I wanted to attend to the book with that in mind. And what I found was a book that, as I said, really pushes at some fascinating ideas around language and logic and the demands we have to communicate as human beings, as a critical aspect of our existence. And yet I also found metaphors that just were ham-fisted or fell flat. And so I want to give examples of each. I want to give some examples of Wallace's writing. If you've never read the book, I want to dig into one of the metaphors a little bit, why I think it works, and another about why I think another fails. And how the excesses of the book fail to cohere. And then at the end, I want to talk about some works that were very clear influences, sometimes explicit influences on David Foster Wallace writing this book in his early 20s, publishing it at 25. And let's have some fun. So I want to start with this passage towards the end of the book. Then Lang said, "You're weird about words, aren't you?" He looked at Lenore. "Are you weird about words? What do you mean? You just seem weird about them, or like you think they're weird." "In what way?" Lang felt his upper lip absently with a finger while he looked into the glass table. "Like you take them awful seriously," he said. "Like they were a big sharp tool or like a chainsaw that could cut you up as easy as some trees, something like that." He looked up at her. "Is that from your education or in terms of college and your major and such?" "I don't think so," said Lenore. She shrugged her shoulders. "I think I just tend to be sort of quiet. I don't think words are like chainsaws, that's for sure." "So that was really all just bullshit, what I said?" Lenore recrossed her legs and played with the wine in her glass. She looked down into her purse with the tickets next to her chair. "I think it's just that my family tends to be kind of weird and very verbal." She looked into the table and sipped. "And it's hard sometimes not being an especially verbal person in a family that tends to see life as more or less a verbal phenomenon." And she goes on in the next page to tell this story about her brother and how he would... Stoney had this stage of his childhood where he called everything brands of things. He'd say, "What brand of dog is that?" Or, "That's the brand of sunset where the sun makes the clouds all fiery." Or, "That brand of tree has edible leaves," etc. She looked over at Lang, who was looking at her in the table. He looked up at her. Lenore cleared her throat, which obviously, wasn't all that big a deal, she continued, although it was kind of irritating, but still understandable, because Stoney watched television like all the time back then. And she goes on to talk about that her brother has this tendency to use the word brand instead of kind. And Lang wants to know, how'd he fall out of that? And there was a summit that didn't work, and eventually it just happened. But there's this interesting bit there where Lang is trying to communicate, and he thinks he's grasped something, and then Lenore says, "Maybe not really." "Oh wait, so I was totally off there?" And that's what this book is fundamentally, I think, about. It's about language. It's about the way that particular nouns and verbs mean things, the context of language, the syntax, particularly with analytical languages versus synthetic languages, where the word order matters versus specific intonations within words dictate the meaning. And that's something that I think Wallace was truly fascinated by. It's something that he's produced 460 pages about. Whether he's succeeding or not, I think there are passages where he really does get at one of the fundamental difficulties of communicating as human beings. And I found that fascinating. It was something I wanted to spend time with. It was something I was talking about, discussing with my wife, examining as I was reading the book. And so that part of the book I think really works. There are gems of passages in here. There's also a really fascinating part where Wallace allows us to see that not only do the words we choose fail us, and that we misrepresent ourselves, but we ourselves fail. Our memories fail us. We can't recall the truth from the memory that we want to extract, and then we can't express that and articulate it truly to another. I realize the irony of all of these ideas, both as a reader, with Wallace as a writer, and as me making this YouTube video. But I think that's what he's trying to grapple with here. And so he has a passage about memory here, in which the character Lenore is speaking with her brother, Stone Cipher Levache Beadsman IV, aka the Antichrist. That'll pop up later. "Oh, now don't be that way," smiled the Antichrist, casually reattaching and strapping the leg, which took a minute. When he was attached, he said, "The drawing is of a sort referred to in the investigations, as I'm sure you remember. The hotshot major would remember a lot better than I, if you thought about it for about 3 seconds. I seem to recollect the reference being on page 54, note B of the Geach and Anscombe translation. Represented with a picture of a man climbing a slope in profile, one leg in front of the other as he progresses, marking motion, walking up the incline, facing the top, eyes directed at the top, all the standard climbing association stuff, etc., etc. So it's a picture of a man walking up a hill. But then Grandma Lenore's own Dr. Wittgenstein says, 'Hold on now, partner,' because the picture could just as clearly and exactly and easily represent the man sliding down the slope, with one leg higher than the other, backwards, etc., just as exactly." "Shit," said Lenore. And then we're invited to draw these totally fecal conclusions about why we just automatically assume from just looking at the picture that the guy's climbing and not sliding, going up instead of coming down, complete and total dribble, and really actually heart-rending psychological innocence, as far as I'm concerned. Which you should remember, given this certain conversation we all had in the Volvo when you were in high school, when Grandma decided I was evil and said I need to be stamped out, declared her intention to stop giving me presents. Anyway, and there we have a character who's drawing on these precise details, this hyper-specific memory that's just tunneled down into his consciousness, and he can draw it all forth. And Lenore is sort of, grasping and then catching up and recollecting these details as well, and seeing how she's missed part of this, that her memory has failed her. But also she must rely on her brother's memory. And is he truly telling the truth there? We have to assume that he is, as readers, as she does as a character. And I think there's this aspect of, that's probably David Foster Wallace being the type of person who's like, well, I can remember things better than everybody else. Like, I remember all these details. And many of us have the memories that we truly can recall in indelible detail. The song that was playing, tiny details about a smell, who was sitting at exact which point in the car or at the table, what meal we were having when that conversation happened, or was it a hand of cards and what were the exact cards in my hand when that happened. Tiny little details, that this series of chess moves that had led to this point. And I think Wallace is expressing and perhaps showing off that he's the type of person who can recall these things. But there's also some element of truth to that our memories do fail us. That is one of the failures of our communication. That it's not just a failure of language, it's a failure within ourselves of what we even want to express with failing language. And there's something really fascinating about that, that I loved within this book. But ultimately, I find the book to be less than the sum of its parts. If I was to use a metaphor from a later Wallace novel, Infinite Jest, I find that in this book, Wallace has too many tennis balls on the court. And there are too many players trying to hit those balls back and forth, and ultimately, they all just end up on the ground. And that is, I think it's a failure of an editor. That David Foster Wallace, even from a very young age, had this sense of excess. And sure, that was representative of our culture, but it was also representative of him as a writer. That it was all about excess, and that there was no joke that was not funny. There's nothing that can't be made, and then if it was funny once, it's funny a second, third, 12th time. And as a reader, I didn't find that. Some of the jokes truly are sophomoric. I think there were criticisms in the 1980s that some of these jokes probably work really well if you're stoned and sitting in your college dorm room. But do they still work, nearly 40 years later as a reader who's nearly 40 years old? And I think the answer is no on many pages. It reminds me a bit of The Catcher in the Rye, a book that seems to speak truth to power to very young people. And then we return to it and go, wait a second, what was the deal here? This kid's a pain in the neck. And yes, perhaps that my saying that is a challenge to some 40-year-old or 50-year-old reader to say, no, it's a masterpiece. I loved it. I found it to be funny on every page. But frankly, I didn't. To give one example, Lenore is a switchboard operator, and one of her colleagues is Candy Manable. Another is Judith Priest. Judith Priest, the joke being a lisp. And that is made numerous times. A second example, we have a character, Norman Bombardini, who is supposed to be representative of this metaphor around self and other, and it's, basic college philosophy. It is above a high school, the jokes are above a high school level, but they're not above necessarily those of a 19-year-old at times. And so we have a character who, confronted with self and other, and he's obese, he's overweight, unable to lose weight, he decides to embrace self and dissolve other by eating so much that he will become gargantuan, and that this is, this deep. And it's also kind of funny, and it's sort of grotesque. And then ultimately, it's none of those things. All of the tennis balls hit the ground, and the game we're watching is just Wallace in the air, and playing with himself, not with any opponent. But as I said, the metaphors that work are fascinating. An example of the excessive writing would be here. And I'll just read one paragraph of what becomes like a 4-page sequence. Lenore Beedsman was in possession of the following items: one of 2 square bedrooms with polished wood floors and inoperative fireplaces on the 3rd floor of an enormous gray house belonging to a Cleveland oral surgeon in East Corinth. 3 large windows, 2 facing west, also clean they squeaked. Only one open because only one had a screen. From the windows, a view of the outside at the right-hand edge of which the tight seam of geometric suburban ground and dim sky was punctured by the far thin teeth of Cleveland. Getting there? Windows through which late in the day came a sustained blast of pumpkin-colored Cleveland sunset. Getting there? Window sills that were really window shelves and jutted out so far from the low window bottoms they could be sat on, and were, although there were nails and sharp perpendicular paint chips, which problem was solved by the placement of black corduroy cushions, which Lenore also owned, on the sills. And maybe the detail of the nails and sharp perpendicular paint chips is the best one in there, the most lifelike, the most realistic and interesting. The pumpkin-colored Cleveland sunset, the thin, sharp teeth of the far thin teeth of the Cleveland horizon, those are good. But the perpendicular paint chips, juxtaposed with the nails, I think that works. There's something there that works. But there's so much information in there, and what of it is really important? What is it telling us about Lenore? What is it telling us about the setting? What is it telling us about anything? And this goes on for 3 pages where we're just treated to details. 11 boxes of books from college, most of them stone Sifo boxes with red ink drawings of laughing babies on the cardboard sides. All the boxes unopened, the athletic tape wheedled from the college trainer on the pretext of a mysterious pre-graduation sore ankle not even cut off yet and turning yellow. A popcorn popper that popped popcorn with hot air. A box of Kleenex. A pretend tortoiseshell hairbrush. And that's the book's problem in a microcosm. Details upon details upon details that never lead to anything important or true. And I think that was a detail that Wallace himself later recognized in an essay in Consider the Lobster on Dostoevsky and biographies of Dostoevsky. Wallace recognized that there was a failure among writers of his age and readers of the society they were writing for to not take ideas seriously, that there was no truth to really get at and grapple with and give a damn about. That truth could only be treated with irony, with subversion, with transgression, with sarcasm, with laughter. And while he was sort of putting this lens on modern writers and modern readers, I think he brings himself in for the indictment to a certain degree. He's never explicit about it, but the way he describes modern writers and their constant jokes and irony, that's a lens that's now pointing at a mirror, I think. Now, I want to get into one metaphor that I thought was really fascinating. This is a huge spoiler, so if you've never read the book, jump off to the recommended if you like. But one metaphor that I loved, one metaphor that I thought was just a little ham-fisted. The metaphor I loved, Lenore has as a switchboard operator, one of the central plot details is that the switchboard is malfunctioning, that the phone lines are not working. Calls are coming into their line that are really supposed to go somewhere else. Calls are going, people are trying to get a hold of them and are bouncing off and getting to this other line. And ultimately it's revealed that there's some issue with the tunnel and the heat, and that the heat has the same temperature as a human being. And I think that metaphor is really about the ultimate failure of communication, that it's representing, we're trying to communicate and we're miscommunicating. We're trying to say something and it's misinterpreted. And I think that does work. There are repeated passages where characters are communicating with each other, and there are two characters who are just having totally different conversations. The lines of dialogue alternate, but it's very clear to a reader that they're on totally different frequencies. They're having totally different conversations. At times, one character will realize this. At times, that character will even say, "That's not what I'm talking about," or "You're talking about this." We have a character who writes all of these stories in which he's trying to communicate some aspect of truth about himself through the stories, and we get all of those stories. And so I think that metaphor, though, of the confused phone lines and all the calls that are bouncing around, I thought that worked. I thought it was sustained at an appropriate level. A metaphor that didn't work, the Great Ohio Desert. What are the three first letters? G-O-D. Didn't need to be spelled out. The Great Ohio Desert is this man-made desert. It's all black sand in southern Ohio that is just a disaster. It's a blast. It's basically a hellscape. And I think that is standing for Wallace's idea that God is a man-made creation, and that organized religion is this blight upon humanity, that humans have created a God that scares them and terrifies them. And he then extends this by sending it up through the televangelist Hartley Sykes, who twists words that a parrot says, and the fact that it's a parrot specifically is another layer of the joke that is just a little too obvious. I think Wallace, showing off how he's the smartest guy in the room, perhaps treats his readers as a little too dumb. The Great Ohio Desert might have worked if it was never spelled out as simply G-O-D anywhere in the text, and readers could just have drawn that for themselves. But I think that's just one example of where there's so much going on that it just doesn't pull together. There are pages subplots that could be excised from the text, and it would not negatively affect it in any way. So it's a cautious recommendation. I think if a younger reader probably enjoys this more than I did, or than an older reader might, and there are aspects that do work within the text. But in terms of some influences, I think an enormous influence is the Glass Stories by J.D. Salinger. We have the precocious Beadsman siblings, very comparable to the precocious Glass siblings. Additionally, we have Salinger's ear for dialogue, and never wanting to sound phony. And I think here we have characters who are intentionally being ironic and sounding phony and such. Whether it's take your pick from the Glass Stories, but I think that was a real clear influence on Wallace. Additionally, The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. The type of humor here is much closer to the type of humor Wallace would approach throughout his career, far more so than Gravity's Rainbow, despite Gravity's Rainbow being a book of excess. This sense of humor, the smirking irony, the conspiracies, why in the Broom and the System have all these characters from a nursing home disappeared, is much closer to what Pynchon is getting at. Additionally, an explicit influence is William Gaddis, I think specifically J.R., because of the overlapping dialogue. The book is almost entirely dialogue here, and so much of the Broom of the System is dialogue when we're not being treated to the inventory of Lenore Beadsman's apartment. So I think this was a huge influence that he explicitly mentioned in interviews. Additionally, The Garden of Forking Paths by Jorge Luis Borges. I would add that I think this really gets at ideas around contingencies and modal logic much more fluidly than Wallace did in his novel. Two other influences: The Tone of a Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, the picaresque, something that Wallace would return to throughout his career, both in the Broom System and Infinite Jest and numerous stories, where there are writers who try to show how intelligent they are. There's also writers who I think genuinely are going for laughs, and I think Wallace was trying for laughs many times. In terms of the hypocrisies that he finds in religion, I would add Omensetter's Luck by William Gaddis. I think this was a crucial influence. With Wallace himself, his early stories are in Girl with Curious Hair, and I think these are much closer to what happens in the Broom of the System, even than Infinite Jest. The essay I'd mentioned in Consider the Lobster, this would probably be my recommendation for where to start with Wallace rather than any of his fiction or certainly Infinite Jest. However, I will say that I think one of his greatest accomplishments as a writer of fiction was to take the Beadsman family from the Broom of the System. The Beadsman siblings, very precocious, capable, just so much smarter than everybody else, and the way that they are this sort of latter century glass family, and then turn those into the incandenzas of Infinite Jest and develop them in interesting ways. I think there are ways where John Beadsman, who could be almost entirely eliminated from the Broom of the System, very explicitly becomes an incandenza brother in Infinite Jest. So I'll leave it for you to figure out which one. In terms of philosophy, Wittgenstein, but also the interpretation by Aristotle in the Organon, and his famous sea battle, which is sort of the germ from which all of modal logic extends. And I don't necessarily recommend this. Just watch a YouTube video or read a couple of entries on Wikipedia. These types of texts are they're basically written as math logic. So if that's something you're really interested in, by all means, go for it. This volume is from Cocciarella and Freund. But if you're not interested, stay as far away as possible. Other influences that Wallace was very explicit about: The Names by Don DeLillo, sort of conspiracy, math, the philosophy behind here, fractious fiction. The Stories of Donald Bartlemay, these are really fun. These are really interesting. I highly, highly recommend these, particularly if you enjoy Borges. Dive into Bartlemay. It's totally different, but itching another nerve for story readers that traditional short stories don't itch. The way that characters tell stories and communicate through stories in Kiss of the Spider Woman by Manuel Puig, I think, was a huge influence. Additionally, the text of the poem and then all of the annotations on that text that provide this greater context by Vladimir Nabokov in Pale Fire, I think was a massive signal post for Wallace. If you want another extended metaphor around consciousness and memory, Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World by Murakami Haruki, I think, is much tighter and focused and accomplishes this a little bit better. It's also basically a contemporary work to the Broom of the System, published around the same time. Additionally, Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. Here we have an extended metaphor that I think is sustained and a little bit tighter than what we see in the Broom of the System. Finally, I think the character of Rick Vigorous is Wallace making fun of the priapic, libidinous male narrator, male writer who's constantly trying to seduce, that was common in the middle of the 20th century and the latter part of the 20th century in U.S. fiction, whether it's Philip Roth in Portnoy's Complaint, Saul Bellow in a variety of his books, Richard Stern with Otherman's Daughters, and earlier work, Ginger Man from J.P. Donlevy. I think all of these are perhaps sent up to a certain degree by Rick Vigorous. With Wallace, I think many writers are trying to seduce their readers. With Wallace, though, I don't think he was just trying to seduce readers with his intelligence, as I said. I really do think he was trying to seduce readers with his laughter. And so if the book does make you laugh, let me know. If this is one you love, let me know. And I'm happy that you're able to enjoy it and derive such pleasure from it. I hope that we're all enjoying and learning from what we read. So hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.